Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're going to go back to the summer of 1962, where the soundtrack to the film of West Side Story was all over the top of the charts. It was a global phenomenon. It's really for people not familiar with the album or for people who didn't live through the time, it's kind of hard to imagine just how big this soundtrack is and just how imprinted many of the individual songs from this soundtrack were on the overall psyche, the overall collective memory of pop culture. Maria, I just met a girl named Maria. What do you do in America? Everything's free in America. And the list goes on. Um, Somewhere, we'll find a new way of living, blah, blah, blah. So many hits on this album. And I'd like to take a look at how the success of this album is something that was unique to its time and something that could perhaps be replicated today. So let's look at what made West Side Story special from the perspective of its time. It was very normal in the first 20 years or so of the long playing record's existence for soundtracks to dominate the record charts. And this included both film soundtracks and musical soundtracks from a Broadway or West End show. Usually, if something was successful on the stage, it would very shortly come to the screen. And this is what happened with West Side Story. It was very successful on Broadway. And so they made a very big production film of it, shot in 70 millimeter. People who got to see the roadshow format heard it in 6-track magnetic sound, the top quality then and really as good as anything today in terms of the quality. So it was a fully fledged production in every sense. The music was composed by Leonard Bernstein, composer and director of the New York Philharmonic, so a bona fide modern orchestral composer and conductor. And the lyrics are by Stephen Sondheim, who would, in the coming years and decades, become one of the biggest, if not the biggest, titans in the history of Broadway, who sits beside luminaries like Lloyd Webber for people who like that sort of music. South Park did a great Broadway Bro Down episode which I highly recommend because it's hilarious and it's brilliant as everything South Park does is. So, the soundtrack became a huge hit because it had really memorable songs. And this is true with many of the soundtracks of this era. Think of all of the memorable songs from The Sound of Music: Doe, a Deer, a Female Deer, Climb Every Mountain, so many hits. South Pacific, Carousel, from where we get You'll Never Walk Alone. And the list goes on. And this had its hits too. It also had my personal favorite, a comedy number called Officer Krupke. But it was definitely in that tradition. And West Side Story in particular was very unabashed in its melding of modern orchestral traditions and the jazz approach to harmony that was something that was very personally influential on Bernstein's own composing, even though he was known for conducting music that was from the European tradition. So he himself was sort of a hybrid individual there. And so it had all of the right components to be a top selling album. But at the same time, there were many things about it which now seem dated. It was theoretically a gangster film, but the gangsters were dancing and singing, and no one really bled out. It wasn't particularly gruesome. It was a family friendly film about gangsters in the middle of a race war. But that was what you could do in the early 60s. 10 years later, by the early 70s, I'm not sure if you could. People were hungry for more realism, even though, to be fair, the plot of West Side Story, considering its 50s origin, was kind of hardcore. There were racial issues, issues dealing with immigration, issues dealing with social change, with violence, with what role the police should play, with young people falling in love, a la Romeo and Juliet. And so it wasn't exactly squeaky clean, but in comparison, compared to what audiences would have demanded, young audiences surely by 1972, it was a bit on the squeaky clean side. And of course, from the late 60s all the way until the new millennium, the 21st century, soundtracks traditionally didn't dominate the the charts the way they did in the 50s, early and even into the mid 60s. Instead, you had the pop album where artists from the genres of rock or soul or R&B or later hip hop dominated the album charts. Of course, there were always some exceptions when a soundtrack was made by a very famous pop artist, Purple Rain, for instance, but there you go. But then we have to look at how now that no longer applies either. And maybe we're almost on the road back to the soundtrack. Certainly, music that's inspired by miniseries or serialized programs or films from the world of streaming can revive music. So there's less original music that's composed specifically for a soundtrack. I mean, that does go on, but not in the elaborate way that it did in the age of West Side Story. But look at how Disney ended up getting Journey's Don't Stop Believing to have probably its ninth life, because that is a song which, much like a cat, has more than one life. But it absolutely came back because of Disney, and young kids became introduced to it, who probably don't know many other songs released in the early 80s. And so maybe we'll see the songs of West Side Story come back. They did try to do a remake of the film a few years ago, but it's one of those things where I don't know if you could exactly remake it, but I think some of the songs could potentially be revived because the songwriting is so strong. And so, because when you take it all in totality, on the one hand, it's a relic of a bygone age. It was released when JFK and Martin Luther King had not been shot. The Vietnam War was only just beginning and the horrors were yet to be known. The inflation of the Nixon closing of the gold window hadn't yet been felt. All of these things that shaped the 70s into a more hyper realistic decade in terms of what people expected from the arts weren't yet happening. I mean, the 70s, don't get me wrong, plenty of escapism, but even this was rooted as a reaction to the realities around them. So on the one hand, it's squeaky clean. On the other hand, the music does stand up. It's that perfect mix of pop music, jazz, and modern orchestral music. Some of the lyrics, particularly on the more serious songs, stand up. There's a place for us. Classic lyric will last forever. What do you do in America? Some could argue that it's more relevant now than ever. Some could argue that it's antiquated. I can see both arguments. So, in terms of the music and lyrics, I think it does stand up. In terms of a gangster film with very little, no bleeding out and all that, I think people can accept it because it was filmed so well in 70 millimeter. But it does bring us back to an era where people would sit at length in a theater and watch a film with no special effects, nothing gruesome about it, nothing explicitly sexual, and they'd listen because of the music and the dancing. Would people do that today? Well, maybe they would if Netflix promoted things about singing and dancing. Certainly, things like American Idol and Glee and High School Musical and all the rest of it have been very popular. So there's a dualistic way to look at it. But in any case, if you are so inclined, you can listen to West Side Story, which has in fact influenced a lot of rock and pop music. You've got Yes, who've done covers of West Side Story songs. You've got The Nice, for example, Keith Emerson, who did America famously and even got in trouble with the law because after performing it once at the Royal Albert Hall in London, he burnt an American flag in protest of the Vietnam War, but was arrested because it was seen as an act of treason towards the US, which obviously he wasn't living in the US at the time, but Britain and the US were even more attached at the hip in some ways at that time than they are today. That's a whole nother video about the changing nature of the relationship between countries like Canada, Britain, America, Australia. But in any case, it's had its impact on the pop music world, to be sure, and in the pop music vernacular. So take a listen, like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.